Okay, good afternoon everyone and welcome. It's 2 p.m. and it's time for me to open this hearing session on Matter 3 relating to the spatial strategy. My name is David Troy. I'm a Chartered Town Planner. I've been appointed jointly with Caroline Malloy, who's also the Chartered Town Planner, by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government under Section 20 of the Planning Communities Purchase Act 2004 as amended, to hold this examination into the soundness of the Holton Delivery and Allocations Local Plan, which I shall refer to now as the plan, and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to its soundness. Before we begin, can everyone hear and see me? Thank you. Can everyone please ensure that their mobile phones are switched off and are on silent whilst the hearings are in session. Please can you ensure that your microphone is muted until you are invited to speak, so that we can avoid disruption from any background noise or feedback from microphones or computers. This hearing session is being live streamed as well as being recorded by the Council and will be published shortly after via a link on the examination website for interested parties to view. Our role as inspectors is to assess whether the plan satisfies the requirements of the 2004 Act, the relevant regulations, and whether it is sound. In order to be sound, the National Planning Policy Framework states plans should be positively prepared, justified, effective, and consistent with national policy. In terms of the Programme Officer for this event, Lynn Donnelly is our Programme Officer for the examination, who met when you joined the meeting. Lynn works for us and independently from the Council. She is responsible for all administration arrangements, and outside the hearing sessions, any contact should be through Lynn. In terms of the hearing sessions, our examination guidance notes on the website at EX12 outline the procedures to be followed at the hearing sessions, the way in which written representations will be dealt with, and the availability of information. The way we expect participants to behave during the hearing sessions is also set out for ease of reference in our virtual hearings etiquette guidance, which also is also been sent out to all participants along with their invitations. The hearing session is programmed to finish no later than 3:30 p.m. today. However, there may be a need for some flexibility on that. The hearing session will be in the form of a structured discussion which I will lead, following the previously circulated agenda, which is based on the matters, issues and question papers already circulated to you. We shall invite people to speak at a particular time, but if you have something to contribute at an appropriate part of the discussion, please indicate that you wish to speak by using the raised hand function on Teams. We ask that you keep your camera switched on for the entire session if possible, but with your microphones muted until you're invited to speak. The only exception to this is where there is more than one participant per representative. In these cases, we ask that only one participant has the camera on at any one time. There may be some questions on which we've already had enough information, and so there may be little or no discussion on these matters. We also like to remind participants that you've provided all your evidence in your original representations, and the hearing sessions are not an opportunity to submit any further information. Any comments you make during the hearing session should therefore relate to the points made in your original representations. We have read your original representations and hearing statements, so there's no need to repeat what you've already stated. The purpose of this session is for us to seek clarification or further information on any outstanding questions we may have. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? If not, I'd just like to ask the participants for the afternoon session just to introduce themselves briefly, please. Start with the Council, possibly that might help. Please.
Hello, my name's Alistair Cross. I'm the team lead for Planning and Transport Strategy here at the Council.
I'm Catherine Brindley. I'm the Principal Planning Officer within the Planning Policy team.
I'm Anne Moyers. I'm a Senior Planning Officer in the Planning Policy team.
Hello, I'm John Hunter. I'm a barrister from King's Chambers representing the council. Thank you.
Okay, if you just go to the developers now, let's start with Dave Trimmingham, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. I'm Dave Trimmingham, Chief Executive at Turley, this afternoon representing Peel Land and Property.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if you just take turns, just introduce yourself briefly, please.
I'll go next then, if it's an open for it. Dan Mitchell from Barton Wilmore on behalf of Estuary Holdings.
Thank you.
Jonathan Burns from Pegasus Group representing Bloor Homes.
Okay, thank you.
Brian O'Connor from Litchfields representing Taylor Wimpey.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Gilbert, a planning associate from Barton Wilmore representing Redborough Homes.
Okay.
Andrew Rose from Sporeforce representing Daresbury SIC, which is the JV delivering SciTech Daresbury.
Thank you.
Conor Valley representing Harworth Group from Madison Young.
Good afternoon, I'm Jonathan Dean. I'm a planning and engineering manager at Homes England.
Okay, is that it now? I've got to.
Sorry, Joanne McGrath.
Yeah.
From SatPlan representing CE Caldwell's Norlands Farm.
Yeah. I've got Tom Robertson and Guy Evans here at all. Okay, right, thank you. Are we just, if we could just ask the programme officer, we're waiting for anybody to join the meeting. No, okay, right. So without further ado, I shall kick off. Basically, we're looking at the spatial strategy for locating developments. And just obviously at this stage, it's obviously really looking at the broad approach to the spatial strategy, not looking at detail at the housing and employment figures, which obviously we're going to cover in the relevant sessions over the next few days. So without further ado, if I could just ask the council, please, briefly, just to briefly explain the broad approach to the spatial strategy, its justification, and whether they consider the spatial strategy as a growth strategy.
Thank you. I say it's Alistair Cross from the council. Effectively, as intimated in Andrew Plant's opening statement, the council very much sees the current plan as being an evolution of the core strategy, which itself was probably an evolution of the unitary development plan. The core strategy examination concluded that we didn't have sufficient development land to meet the needs north of the River Mersey, and committed the council to undertaking a Greenbelt review. Subsequently, we basically looked at, with the revised housing figures, we concluded that the plan actually had to look at Greenbelt both north and south of the river, and we undertook a revised scoping exercise on that to advertise that. The plan we see as being quite balanced. There is limited development land available within the urban area. What land there is available, particularly in Widnes, is located to in the southern part of, mostly located in the southern part of the town, is largely contaminated from former early chemical industrial uses, and is really more suitable for employment reuse. In Runcorn, as was mentioned previously, the Runcorn was a former new town, and the plan effectively is continuing or seeing to the completion of the former new town with the continued allocations at Sandymore, which is coming forward for development. Warford Farm, which Louise Home England is bringing forward for development, and again slight outward expansion up to Keckwick Hill, which now has actually the benefit of either full hybrid or outline planning consent. In terms of Widnes, we're having to look at a slight degree of outward expansion. And obviously there's this town being quite constrained. We can either go north, which we are doing in certain locations, or to go south, which again we are doing in certain locations. The council considers that the plan strikes the appropriate balance in terms of that. The core strategy, there was a lot of debate. It probably took up half of the examination on the fabled housing split north-south of the river. A lot of examination time was taken up with that, and the examination concluded that a split with the housing 57-43, slightly in favour of Runcorn, was appropriate. The new plan effectively continues pretty much with that sort of distribution, although it doesn't necessarily state it in such broad terms. Effectively, our members consider the borough very much to be one authority, one borough, and they get a little bit upset whenever it's divided and split in two. So the plan, whilst the allocations, I think in terms of the housing allocations, if memory serves me correct, is actually 62% in favour of Runcorn. The employment land is similarly, say, slightly skewed towards Runcorn, but again, it's largely, driven by the availability of land, particularly in South Widnes, and the need to regenerate former despoiled sites. The core strategy being following the guidance at the time, which is intended to be able to be used for development control purposes, actually identified a number of key areas of change, identified 4 key areas of change. They pretty much followed on from the approach in the Unitary Development Plan, which identified a number of regeneration areas. The Unitary Development Plan, we were quite successful, and we were lucky to secure government funding to deliver comprehensive regeneration on some of those regeneration areas, the main one being the Castlefields area. So the new plan is seen as a continuation of that. We have moved away slightly from the key areas of change in the core strategy, and the thinking behind that in terms of how we treat it in policy terms was to try and avoid introducing duplication and the potential for confusion in the plan by having the broad brush policy approach from the core strategy for the key areas of change and the detailed allocations and development management policies that are contained within the new plan. So we have moved away from having specific policies for the key areas of change, or as we now have, the key urban regeneration areas. The key urban regeneration areas are effectively the former key areas of change, with the addition of another area for North Widnes, given the fact we've been committed to doing a Greenbelt review, and thereby we are forecasting significant development within the North Widnes area.
Just the rounding question, obviously, was just, do you consider it's a growth strategy? That's basically what, just as a sort of an overview there, please, just in terms of your broad approach.
It can be considered as a growth strategy. Clearly, the development figures for housing are above the suggested demographic need. The employment is pretty much based on past trends. However, we do have the enterprise zone, and they're represented here today. The Daresbury SciTech Daresbury site, which has the potential for significant employment growth. We are a partner in the Liverpool City region, and whenever we were drafting the plan, obviously we had regard to the enterprise zone plan for growth. And indeed, we actually worked alongside the enterprise zone in commissioning some of the evidence base that was intended to be a shared evidence base between the enterprise zone plan for growth and the constituent local authorities' local plans as they came forward.
You touched on a number of the constraints, obviously, that have influenced the levels of growth in Runcorn, Widnes, Hale. You mentioned contamination. Are they basically, obviously, your other constraints that have influenced, obviously, you mentioned the Greenbelt, other constraints, and also opportunities that you've sort of looked at, basically, when looking at the split between the two areas?
The Greenbelt study is obviously one of the key factors that we have looked at. Obviously, particularly north of the river, we are very close, the Greenbelt boundaries are very narrow because we are very close to some of the neighbours, and each of the neighbours is themselves promoting development that is, in certain cases, narrowing the gap. So there are certainly areas of the Greenbelt where the gap is considered as being a crucial issue. In the Greenbelt study, we do quite clearly say that, following guidance, that none of the 5 purposes is more important than any of the others. But in certain locations where the gaps are particularly tight, then obviously, that is a major concern in order to avoid the merging of settlements. And that is a case to a degree, I say, and affecting some potential sites in North Widnes and also in some sites in Runcorn, particularly with the gap towards Bonington, which I think was mentioned previously this morning.
Okay, there was obviously some questions raised about obviously how the market areas, obviously in terms of how the core strategy operated previously, the market areas to the north and south of the river operating, whether they operate independently or not, and do they have different market characteristics? Could you just touch on that matter? And then if you just tell me really what the impact of new infrastructure, improving infrastructure have been in recent years on how the markets may have operated, particularly in relation to the opening of the new Mersey Gateway Bridge.
It feels strange actually having a plan, but we're not promoting the Mersey Gateway Bridge, having it now finally opened after several decades. The core strategy looked at this in great detail, and it did conclude that the Widnes and Runcorn, to use the shorthand north-south of the river, Widnes and Runcorn did broadly operate as sub-markets within the wider housing market area. I think from memory, the census showed that about 7% of migrants crossed the river. I think in the northern direction, I think it was 5% in the southern direction, which shows that they do, whilst there are interconnections, they're not necessarily operating as one single market. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
It's just really how times moved on since core strategy. Really, it's really the question. The big question, obviously, is whether they do operate independently. That was one of the challenges that has been put to you, really. And obviously, do they have different market characteristics? That's the first part of the question.
In terms of different market characteristics, I don't particularly think so. I say they are both mixed communities. They do both offer a range of different housing types. The housing stock is slightly different in Runcorn. Being a former new town, it's probably a preponderance of 3-bedroom terrace properties, whereas in Widnes it's more sort of like council housing estates. Which were maybe sort of like 3-bedroom, semi-detached to a degree. But in terms of, say, the characteristics, the type of market, they are generally similar. Both areas have the former terraced areas, and they also have the more aspirational housing that's been delivered in recent years. In Widnes in particular, it's the Upton Rocks area, which the council was instrumental in bringing forward, and as say, and also some additional housing sites that have been built on the periphery, such as Red Rose, Lancaster Place development off of Huntsheath Road, and the other Red Road development on Derby Road. We do have a history of recycling of sites, so I say you will hear have a bit of debate about the impact of windfall, and we have been lucky that where sites have become available, that they have been taken up by the markets and largely developed. Some examples of that being the former Fairfield High School site, which is currently, I think, just finished being developed, partly for housing and also partly for the new cemetery for Widnes. In Runcorn, as I said, a large portion of the development, or the focus of the development, is the remaining Newtown area. So Sandymore has probably been the prime delivery of new housing over the most recent years, with a number of developers on site, and hopefully that they should be getting a new local centre. So the planning application for the adverts for the new co-op submitted last week, so hopefully that site will be getting its own dedicated local centre shortly. Again, there has been there are redevelopment opportunities, and where they've become available, sometimes from the freeing up of former school sites or education sites, they've been taken up by the market, and they have been quite successful in delivering them. In terms of, say, of aspirational, Sandymore had a reputation a little bit of being a slightly more affordable location to some of the competing sites in South Warrington. And we did hear that particularly there was issues in terms of retention of families there because of the lack of a high school. But the local community basically got together and were successful in getting permission to develop a free school. And so that we now have Sandymore High School has been developed in the area close to where the local centres to be located, to basically provide secondary school provision within that neighbourhood.
Okay, just that final bit of the question really about how the impact of new infrastructure improvements in recent years between the two areas, how has that basically affected the actual growth and decisions about distribution of housing and employment between the two areas?
I say previously the town was blighted, particularly by the single crossing of the River Mersey, the former Silver Jubilee Bridge, which has just reopened after being refurbished last week. The main problem was effectively the unpredictability of journeys. If you had an accident on the approaches to the bridge, then effectively it would add half an hour, 45 minutes to your journey. So the predictability was a major issue and seen as a barrier between the two settlements. After many years of lobbying, we were successful in securing the provision of the second crossing, the Mersey Gateway. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to be provided as a free crossing, and so it is subject to tolls. However, the council has basically agreed that residents of Halton can register individual vehicles and qualify for free crossings, so it doesn't impact on the movement of Halton residents north and south of the river.
Okay, and as the only other major infrastructure improvements that have occurred that may have influenced the pattern of development between pattern of growth between them? Any of the sort of specific ones you may want to point out at this stage?
I don't think there's been anything particularly recent, no. Okay.
And just obviously some of the challenges are really regarding the distribution of the housing and employment growth between Runcorn and Windus-Hale. Basically, are they appropriate? I think you've touched on that. And really, is the level of growth proposed in each area, does it really reflect the different housing employment needs in those areas? I think if you could just answer those questions, please.
I believe that the evidence that we have does support that. In terms of employment, I think it's touched on, or it's covered in Figure 12 on the economy topic paper SD 33. And in terms of housing, we had population. We had looked. In terms of housing, we had looked at the number of households likely to be generated by the current population using a cohort survival calculation, and that's set out in housing topic paper Figure 14, so that's document SD 32, with some supporting text at paragraph 10.4. they both clearly show that there's likely to be an excess of households generated in Runcorn over Widnes, and there's likely to be an excess of jobs generated in Runcorn over Widnes.
Right. And the other challenges regarding the amount of employment land versus the housing split, basically, obviously the large areas of employment within basically Widnes versus the actual challenges that housing, there's a greater number of proportion of housing. Is that a significant factor, do you think, or not?
No, I say in terms of hectareage, the split is maybe slightly moot in terms of employment, because obviously the Daresbury SciTech site is not necessarily the largest in terms of hectareage, but it does have potential to generate significant jobs. So so that very much does skew the figures towards Runcorn. Although I think, having said that, if you actually look at the underlying growth, taking out the growth point, the enterprise zone, it still actually shows more jobs generation and potential jobs generation in Runcorn.
Okay. What I'm going to do now is, obviously, I know a number of the actual participants have raised issues regarding the balance between that I've raised here. So I'm just going to open up the actual discussion, if I could. A number of participants, if I probably have to start with Dave Trimmingham, I think, who's raised some issues regarding the split, and then basically if they should raise their hand if they want to participate in this particular discussion, then I'll pick those if I could. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, take a different view to that which has been set out by Mr. Cross in terms of the evidence for what is the right amount, of housing in particular, but also of employment land in the right place. And I think so. It is fundamental that Halton is perhaps slightly unusual in having two housing market areas which are as distinct as they are. Mr. Cross quoted 5% and 7% of migration across the river, as it were. To me, that's a high degree of separation of the operation of those housing markets, and that should be reflected in the plan. And fundamentally, so I don't think it is fully reflected. I don't think the strategy is properly based on the evidence of the operation of those markets and the characteristics of those markets. I've set out in our representations in September 2019 in a good degree of detail, so I'm conscious that you said you don't want things to be repeated. Our hearing statement does cross-refer to the relevant sections of the representations we submitted, but I think in essence the issue here is, I think there's an assumption in the strategy that if an excess, as Mr. Cross mentioned, of housing is created in one part of the borough, it will be met in the other. But that, I don't think, properly takes account of the different housing markets the two parts of the borough are within. And I think the evidence shows that the north, for example, Widnes, in terms of housing market area, has much more connection with Warrington and St Helens than it does with Runcorn. So if an excess of housing need were generated, or an unmet housing need were generated in Widnes, it's more likely to put pressure elsewhere in that housing market than it is to drive further housing delivery in Runcorn. And I think some of the evidence we refer to shows that housing delivery since the core strategy has been broadly equal, broadly 50-50 between the two parts of the borough, that job growth has been significantly stronger in the north. In Widnes there's been a growth of employment, whereas in Runcorn there's been a mild reduction in employment. That the infrastructure that you were asking questions around, sir, has tended to favour the strategic location in the north, better connection to the primary route network, things like 3MG, the big development in Widnes, connections into South Liverpool, which itself is a big economic driver in the sub-region. growth at the airport, the Eastern Access Transport Corridor and so on. I think those are all indicators that the pattern of recent economic performance and different market characteristics between the two areas will, if anything, be sustained and become more marked over the plan period. And so the core strategy, as Mr. Cross mentioned, settled on a 57-43 split. That was having considered a more sort of 60-40 split, which is where the DALP now is, and the 60-40 split was explicitly rejected by the core strategy inspector as being effectively unsustainable, and that one couldn't assume that needs that went unmet in Widnes would be met in Runcorn. I think the evidence shows that nothing has changed to alter that, except perhaps to confirm that that is the different operation in the housing markets. Market signals are that demand is higher, job growth is higher, prices are higher in the north, and that is where the core strategy, I think, in its proposed split of development between the two, doesn't adequately reflect the evidence. So I'm happy to pause there. I'm sure others will want to come in. And you've got reference to the various data I've alluded to there in our statement and representations.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Burns, please.
Thank you, sir. Just on the infrastructure point.
Could you turn the camera on if you could as well? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, my camera is on, but
all right, okay.
You just can't see me. I'll try switching it on and off, but
okay, yeah, maybe that's
that may. Has that worked? Excellent.
Yeah.
Just on the infrastructure point, obviously the Halton Curve opened up in May 2019, and my understanding is that significantly improved the number of rail trips across the river, that providing a link between Liverpool and North Wales, which hadn't been there, I think, since the Beeching cuts. So that's an additional piece of infrastructure that will have no doubt improved connectivity across the bridge. I think the importance of the Mersey Gateway Bridge was also acknowledged by the core strategy inspector, and obviously it was left to a what if scenario because of the lack of certainty over it. But he did say that the bridge that is due to open will improve links between these two markets, but this will depend to an extent on the nature of any toll fees that are charged. Obviously, Mr. Cross has helpfully highlighted the fact that Halton residents don't have to pay those charges. As a resident of neighbouring Warrington, we had previously been promised that we wouldn't have to pay them either, but that changed. But I think it's very important to understand the significant contribution Mersey Gateway Bridge and now the reopening of the Silver Jubilee Bridge will have on improving that connectivity. I think there was a press release by Merseyflow, who operate the bridge toll system, and they found that their customers on average save 42 minutes a week based on previous trips undertaken when it was just the single crossing. Obviously there's a significant business case behind the Mersey Gateway in terms of time saving, and obviously that will no doubt increase people's ability and wish to cross the river, and whether that be for work or willing to actually live the other side of the river. Either way, I think also the distribution properly reflects the constraints north of the river, which Mr. Cross has pointed to, and a lot of these constraints are identified in the exceptional circumstances paper that the council produced. In addition, the Greenbelt contribution of the parcels to the north has to be taken into account, which also Mr. Cross has also referenced. So I think where the council is with the distribution and the split between north and south, it is correct.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Burns. Dan Mitchell, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Hopefully you can hear me.
Thank you, yeah.
In terms of the balance overall, and sort of not wanting to get dragged into too much detail, I do concur with what Mr. Trimmingham's evidence has said and what he's put forward to you. This is very clearly, if you take a helicopter view of this district, it is very clearly split north and south. That's how the whole framework, the whole local plan is framed. And I think it's therefore highly unusual for a plan like this not to set out very clearly a percentage housing distribution between Widnes and Runcorn. It's also very unusual not to have some degree of a distribution model apportioning growth to each of the key urban regeneration areas listed in CSR1. And I say that because the council ultimately has to report, measure and monitor the effectiveness of this policy moving forwards. And I really challenge how that can be achieved without an apportionment of percentage expressly stated in the policy. The council's position was that this is a strategy that has evolved rather than a revolutionary position. And I just wanted to go back and say that I concur with Mr. Trimmingham's observation. I'm going to just give you that reference and a bit more information, because the 57-43% split that was set out in it's actually tables 1 and 2 of the 2013 core strategy, that was very much based on an anticipated approach. Now, I wanted just to refer to one of the documents, which was EL 101, and I don't know whether you've got access to that, sir, in your library, particularly paragraphs 2.3 and 2.4.
If you just elaborate, I'll obviously take note of particular comments, and I'll be able to look at that.
And the reason I refer to this is because what the council doesn't do and doesn't give us information on is that distribution between Runcorn and Widnes over a long period of time. And the only place I could find that was in paragraphs 2.3 and 2.4 of EL 101. If I just read that section out, it does say that since 2010, and this is a document that's 2020, so over the last 10 years, in effect, there have been 4,270 net dwellings completed in Halton at an average of 427 dwellings per year. Now, I'll stop there at that point, noting for your Matter 4 session that is, of course, a number that's higher than that's been put forward in this local plan. And it's a position that didn't obviously have the benefit of any Greenbelt land releases in North Widnes, which is where the housing market sits. Paragraph 2.4 of EL 101 states in its second sentence that since 2010, 2,177 net dwellings have been completed in Runcorn and 2,093 in Widnes. So as Mr. Trimmingham put to you, sir, what has actually been completed in this district over the last 10 years is a 50-50 split. And that's a 50-50 split without the benefit of the growth opportunities of the Greenbelt sites. So it's quite clear that the core strategy position that's put forward before, that's evolved into this spatial approach, didn't work. Now, Mr. Cross put to you that the new distribution in new allocations is born out of a split of 62% and 38%. Again, I don't find that stated anywhere in the local plan at all. I think Mr. Cross has done what we did when we looked at this, which is tot up all the numbers in RD1 and divide them between Runcorn and Widnes. And I think that this is important because our case, we've got a safeguarded land north of Widnes, which was an allocation in the preferred options and then was subsequently downgraded to safeguarded land. Our case is that a number of those sites in the Runcorn area, within the urban area, are not going to deliver at the rate envisaged. It is quite clear that Widnes is the attractive housing market. I don't think there is anyone around this table today that's advocating more greenfield land releases on the Runcorn side of the borough. So if we want to achieve a level of growth, which is what we should be aiming for as part of this local plan, and bearing in mind our Matter 4 case that the plan doesn't go far enough, we need to be looking more towards delivery north of the borough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Just going back to the council, obviously, in terms of the framework, obviously, the plan needs to adequately provide an overall strategy for the pattern, scale and quantity development as required by the framework. Given some of the challenges that have been put, obviously, in submissions, and obviously the participants' comments are regarding the challenges in both those areas, do you think there should be more specific figures set out? Is the balance right between the two? And should the approach, why has the approach differed so since the core strategy?
I would say that a couple of points. One, I would say that the approach hasn't differed from the core strategy. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear when I said that, when I mentioned the 62%. I did say that it wasn't expressed in those terms in policy or in the plan. However, the allocations did total 62%. So yes, I got the calculator out. I totted it up, and that's the proposed allocation, the split of allocations in the plan. With regards to the jobs delivery, again, we don't particularly recognise, it's an assertion that's constantly made, but we don't particularly recognise the figures. In our response to your additional questions, we have basically provided some information in regard to the Business Register Employment Survey that's been referenced by a number of parties, which is basically showing quite stratospheric employment growth, and we had some concerns about that. But on the paper at the chart under paragraph 3.6, we basically show the change of employees 2015 to 19, full and part-time, and that provides a growth, a difference for Runcorn and Widnes. Admittedly, I say we ourselves don't believe that the growth shown in Runcorn is accurate, and we have been investigating with the Office for National Statistics about the particular spike in the health sector. My colleague in our research section actually came back to me yesterday and said he had a response which effectively said that it wasn't a data anomaly. They think it was a business that basically had doctors, and they recorded a central pay point, and that was about 2,500 part-time jobs, as mentioned in the text. But notwithstanding, you can quite clearly see that table shows that the majority of the recent growth in employment has actually located in Runcorn, not in Widnes, as is being put to you today. And in terms of the long-term trends, the Employment Land Report, EL 101, yes, I mean, it does show, again, a table, I believe it's figure 2, and that does show the trends over about the last 10 years, the split of the development, the housing development north and south of the river. I would say that it is sort of difficult to draw conclusions on quite short-term charts, because traditionally, I think the percentage does tend to fluctuate north and south of the river, and yes, that will to a degree sometimes be influenced by the availability of land. For instance, there was a preponderance of completions in Widnes over a period whilst the Sandymore site was stalled. It basically started development, and then due to unexpected flooding in certain locations, development was paused while a lot more hydrological work and investigation was undertaken, and then certain mitigation matters put in place. So again, the development was very much more skewed towards Widnes during that period. So yes, the fact that the core strategy's proposal to release greenbelt sites hasn't yet come to fruition is potentially acting as a slight delay to the availability of land in Widnes. But we wouldn't say that that meant that the strategy is not working. It's just that it's taken slightly longer to have this plan in place that has dealt with the Greenbelt release.
And do you think there's more? Obviously, the challenges are regarding whether specific percentages should be set within the actual within the plan to give more specific focus. Do you think that's would that be relevant to the effectiveness of the plan in terms of ensuring that it's sound?
I personally don't think it would make much of a difference. The populations north and south of the river are sort of 50-50. That's not a huge disparity either side of the river. We would say that the plan is not looking to put in place any phasing of the housing release, and the plan will be subject to 5 yearly reviews. So effectively, if the market is stronger one side of the river or the other, then that will clearly be picked up through the mechanisms of the standard methodology and will potentially affect future plans. But I don't think there's actually anything before you today that warrants the inclusion of the split at this time.
And just the challenge regarding the issue that potentially witness, there may be leakage to areas north affected the river if basically the Runcorn area isn't performing in the way that you hope. Is there any sort of underlying issues that you need to look at in terms of the distribution, or do you think is it a sound approach?
Again, I think, as I say, the local plan, the core strategy inspector dealt with this, and the both migration and also in terms of travel to work, in terms of commuting, and effectively concluded that because we are surrounded by neighbouring authorities with neighbouring housing markets and neighbouring job markets and job opportunities, it's actually, people can commute shorter distances from large parts of Widnes, commuting into the Omega site in Warrington, or commuting into South St Helens, commuting into some of the new developments at Halewood, in Knowsley and Liverpool City, then it would be a shorter commute than travelling to some of the employment developments in Runcorn. So we are a very urbanised area, and I say the commuting patterns, which we mentioned this morning, it's 23,000 commuting in and 23,000 commuting out each day. So, yes, there is a large degree of commuting. It doesn't necessarily follow that all of that commuting is unsustainable.
Okay, I'm just going to turn to some of the participants. Ian Gilbert, I think if you raise your hand if you just want to come in now, please.
Thank you, sir. So you'll note from our representations that we don't specifically look to challenge the council on its distribution of sites north and south of the river, albeit we do think that for transparency and future planning that allocating an amount of development or setting out the quantums of development that is expected to be seen north and south of the river would be beneficial. You'll see also from our representations, these are points for other matters that we'll discuss tomorrow and next week, that we do think there is indicators that growth is likely to be greater than predicted in Halton at the moment, and we are going to be asking you, sir, to consider mechanisms for early review of the plan, albeit we consider the one that's before you now is sound. I think building on what Mr. Trimmerman said and Mr. Mitchell said, that as those changes happen, we believe that all of that, the driver for that growth will be to the north of the river. We think there's a chance that the economic growth for the borough is likely to be greater than the council expects. And we also think that as the Liverpool City region SDS progresses, that there are going to be shortfalls in family housing arriving from Liverpool, and we also note the comments from Mr. Trimmer about Warrington. So we do feel that the strategy needs to, when we come on to safeguarded land, needs to be north of the river looking, and B, when it comes to the 5-year review of the plan, that the transparency in what's been delivered and what the expectations of the plan were is going to be really important, to which extent we echo Mr. Mitchell's comments. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Trevington, please.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to respond to the comments Mr. Cross made in relation to the evidence and the appropriate timing for a review of the plan. Mr. Cross said we review the plan every 5 years. I would just note that we are 8 years on from the core strategy, and it's that process of review and taking account of evidence since that core strategy was adopted is critical for the consideration today. That's not a matter for just for 5 years' time and a review. And so just to make sure that for your note you have the references to our evidence that for example, population has grown faster in the north, and market signals are that housing demand is stronger in Widnes and job growth is higher. So in September 2019, with our representations, we submitted a paper that was called Technical Review of the Housing Requirement for Halton. We were respondent 02785. And I would ask you particularly to take a look at section 5 there, sir, which deals with the various indicators that we've talked about and uses a review of evidence since the core strategy of what's happening on the ground to inform the position that we stated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mitchell, you've still got your hand raised. Is that, are you still wanting to come in on this issue, or have you?
Sorry, I didn't realise I had my hand raised. Just really, the council mentioned that they'd also got out their calculator and totted up their housing numbers to give you those 62% and 38% figures. I think where this goes for me is the effectiveness of these policies moving forwards, and what happens if one or a number of the sites where there's less house builder interest start to fail or don't come forward, and that's really what we're driving at here, is the effectiveness of these policies going forwards, because it seems to me that the spatial strategy has been driven by looking at where the sites are rather than what the council is really wanting to achieve overall. And I think that's the crux of the issue really for us, which a number of us now raised quite significant concerns about.
Ms. Cross, do you want to just come back on that point about obviously whether that is the case, whether there is a concern that obviously if sites aren't delivering, that you haven't got an overall approach in terms of the actual the Halton local plan? If you just come back on that particular point, thank you.
We do publish we have published a brownfield register, but I say effectively we're not aware of any particular areas or sites that are failing. I can personally only think of like one large site that has stopped, and that's the development in Runcorn Old Town, which is known as the Deck. Originally had permission for, I think it was 9 large apartment blocks, of which I think 6 have been completed. And basically the market stalled and they've never come back on stream. Those sites do remain as potential allocations, although the capacities have been adjusted to reflect that they're likely to come forward for lower density or certainly less high-rise development. We're unlikely to see 7 and 8 stories built on the remainder portion of the site. Other than that, as I said, the number of sites in the borough have come forward. The number of sites that you wouldn't necessarily think would be easy to deliver or attractive to the market. One that springs to mind is, admittedly, as in Widnes, the site of a former asbestos factory, which had very significant decontamination requirements. And that site is now basically nearing completion, a mixture of housing development over, I think it was 3 phases by Bellway, I think, could stand to be corrected on that. And a new shopping centre, a new Lidl. Elsewhere where brownfield sites come forward, they do seem to be taken up by the market and delivered quickly, sometimes with RSL support. The recent one being on Page Lane across from Widnes Town Centre, joint development involving Halton Housing Trust, which I think delivered about 128 units in 1 year. But similarly, the private sector is delivering a brownfield site in Runcorn on the site of the former college. So whenever the sites are available, the market is picking them up and is delivering them unless there's particular site-specific issues to prevent them. But I say I'm not aware of very many sites that fall into that latter category.
Okay, thank you. I'm not got any further questions on this point at this particular point of time. I'm going to just quickly touch on the essay, basically, if I could. Obviously, the alternative spatial strategies for the distribution of housing and employment growth, were they considered, and does the preferred option represent the appropriate strategy when considered against reasonable alternatives?
Again, I say the options we're a very small, tightly constrained borough, so the options available to us are somewhat limited. In terms of, I say, and earlier in the process, looking at fully brownfield, we don't have the full brownfield planned. In the essay, we did look at having a particular either a Widnes focus or a Runcorn focus. And again, as mentioned, we do accept that the two sides of the river are slightly separate housing markets, so it wouldn't be appropriate to try and meet the needs of Widnes by providing 100% of the housing in Runcorn, and similarly, it wouldn't be suitable to try and meet the needs of Runcorn by providing 100% of the housing in Widnes. The council considers that the split that it has in the plan represents the most appropriate in the circumstances. Yes, there is a degree of some of the allocations driven by the land availability, particularly East Runcorn, where, as I've mentioned before, part of the site, Sandymore and Warford Farm, are former Newtown areas, benefiting from former Newtown consents. We have the Keckwick Hill developments being brought forward by Redrow. That largely has the benefit of either full planning consent, outline planning consent, or hybrid consents. So they are shown on the plan. But where we are looking for new sites, I say effectively, yes, there are more new allocations, new completely fresh allocations in Widnes, because we are understanding of the need to find additional land in Widnes, and we believe that we are looking to find the appropriate amount of additional land in Widnes.
Okay, and just there was some issue regarding the detail in the essay regarding the various options that you've actually set out in the actual essay itself.
I'm sorry, what would you like me to comment on?
Just the level of detail regarding, actually, you've obviously got a number of options set out in the essay appraisal, obviously relating to the current proposals, Runcorn Focus, Widnes Focus and Cross Boundary. There was just an issue raised during the representations about the level of detail that was set out in relation to each of those that were tested.
Again, the council considers that the level of detail was sufficient for the job that the essay was doing.
Okay, I'm just going to open up again if anybody's got any specific comments they want to raise in relation to the essay and whether reasonable alternatives were considered. Okay, yeah, Mr. Tremian.
Thank you, sir. I mean, I think our comment on the essay is, given everything that was considered at the core strategy, and this is the council saying it's evolving the plan, then to consider either a continuation of the split between the two market areas, or very much emphasis to one or the other, is an odd set of options, and that it would have been appropriate to consider perhaps a 60-40 and a 40-60, or a narrower range of options, given what we know about the two distinct areas and the operation of the market.
We could just ask Mr. Cross, is that a valid point in terms of obviously specific splits? Would that have been given a more representative, reasonable options, or in terms of the actual approach?
I think it's the question slightly of where do you draw the line. I say we feel that the appraisal looked at the broad options available to the council. Say apply, you say 60-40, but you basically Mr. Trimming number 4 had stated that it should be the core strategy 57-43. How many options do we need to appraise? We feel we appraised the broad options, and that to say obviously the sustainability side is one issue, but also meeting the needs of the community or the separate communities has to be met, and so we think that the split does meet those aims of meeting the needs of all the communities within the borough.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got no further questions on the essay at this stage. Obviously, we've touched on it in our matters one this morning. So I'm just going to a final question on this, sort of talk about the spatial distribution. It's just obviously how the plan aligns with other key strategies for Halton and the wider Liverpool city region. If you could just give me some background, obviously, in terms of those issues. Thank you.
Again, as I said, we very much see the DALP as being a continuation of the core strategy. The core strategy, it seems it was written on many moons ago under a different regime. But the starting point for the core strategy and setting out the strategic objectives and the vision was the sustainable community strategy. And whilst those are no longer updated, that was very much the starting point where we've been looking forward. We have obviously taken account of the wider strategies, such as the LEP's plan for growth. We've taken account, or we either support or are supporting or are supportive of the local transport plan and the new combined transport plan for the area, and we're obviously a full partner in the emerging sustainable delivery strategy, the city region plan, which we think our plan will very much nest in with the broad strategic options coming forward through that plan.
And those, again, going back to my original question about the growth, are they? Do you think they're very much? It's linked into the regional approach to growth. What Halton is trying to achieve in terms of their development strategy or spatial strategy.
Yes, I say the city region is looking for growth. We do have a growth deal, which is partly funded. I believe the first 5 years is funded. We are supportive of the delivery of the enterprise zone. In fact, the council is a full partner in the joint venture looking to bring forward that site as a high quality science park, one of the two main and national science parks in the country, with the jobs, the potential that does generate.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the second part of my agenda that I circulated, which is just relating to the key urban regeneration areas. Obviously, if you could just out briefly, I know you've touched on them probably already just slightly, but how the 5 regeneration urban areas were identified and why does this differ from the approach taken in the Halton core strategy?
So, sorry, just to mention Mr. Rose has his hand up.
All right, okay, yeah. Mr. Rose, do you want to come back on something relating to the spatial strategy? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It was just a short point, really, sir. It's just related to your last question around the alignment of the strategy with the Liverpool City region. Just to touch on, sir, that clearly we think the spatial strategy does fully align with the Liverpool City region and the regional strategies alike. Clearly, in terms of SciTech Daresbury and the enterprise zone, they're clearly enshrined regionally, but also nationally within that context, really in terms of the Science and Innovation Centre and Health and Life Sciences, particularly around the industrial strategy, which quotes that. And I think that is pulled into the Halton plan. And clearly there are great aspirations with the park and with the evolution of that Mr. Cross has obviously touched on. And I think in terms of the strategy, clearly that is quite a bit of a change. Particularly, we've looked at the core strategy and what splits there are there, but clearly that can have a leading sort of impression in terms of what the splits are as well in terms of that strategy. I think the strategy that the council have put forward is robust and rigorous and fully aligns the employment and the housing. And clearly we are looking regionally and sub-regionally. I think sometimes just need to take a little bit of a step back in terms of the particular percentages that we're looking at and look at the broad thrust of what we're actually seeking to achieve in terms of that strategy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rose. Thank you very much. Is any other points raised in relation to the spatial strategy or any other key strategies within the actual Liverpool region before I move on just to the question I just raised regarding the urban key regeneration areas? Yeah, okay. If we just, Mr. Cross, if we just ask you to just, if you go back, so basically it's obviously how the 5 urban regeneration areas were identified and why does this differ from the approach taken in the Halton core strategy?
Yeah, thank you. As I said, the core strategy identified the urban regeneration areas and basically set out a pen picture for each of the areas that was intended to be able to be used for development control purposes before the full development plan was adopted. We found from operation of those some confusion, particularly with the inclusion of specific numbers. And I think the key site was South Widnes, where we had a couple of, we identified a quite low housing figure for the South Widnes area, representing what we thought was the secure figure we thought it could be delivered. However, a number of sites did come forward during the early years of the core strategy to promote housing significantly above that, and it did cause confusion with development control as to why the policy said 100 houses and we've got an application for 300 houses. What's the operation of the policy? How does that work? Whenever we were coming to do the delivery and allocations plan, obviously we looked at the key areas of change and say the principle of them being sort of the key areas where we expect the majority of development to be located is still very much the case. However, we felt we couldn't retain the core strategy policies simply because we'd be introducing duplication and potentially inconsistencies within the plan. So we considered whether or not it would be worth basically having standalone policies for these areas separate from the general housing, employment, mixed-use allocation policies. And we couldn't find justification for that approach. It might tick one box, but it would make the plan as a whole more disjointed, more difficult to read, and more difficult to use. So we basically stepped away from having standalone policies for these areas. However, as I say, the plan's in evolution. We continue to make reference to the key areas where we see potential growth or change being delivered. The difference, or one of the prime differences, as you intimated, is that we have added North Widnes because the core strategy obviously didn't identify potential areas for the Greenbelt release, and therefore the additional development that would come from that. With this plan, obviously, we are looking at potential allocations across a swathe of sites across North Widnes, and therefore we felt it would fit the same criteria for being identified as one of the key urban regeneration areas.
Okay, and some of the representatives have talked about the need to identify the scale of housing and employment growth in each of those areas. Again, obviously, it sort of touches on the points we've covered in the previous discussion, but if you just sort of could give me the council's view really on, obviously, on this approach of identifying specific figures for those particular areas.
Again, I think we don't have a huge objection to including reference to the total figures, but we would counter that it doesn't add anything particularly to the plan. It does risk adding a degree of confusion into the plan where potentially those figures will be seen as either maximums or minimum, depending on whether you're the community or the development community. The plan does identify the sites within the allocations for both housing and employment that are within the key areas. So again, we could do it, but we don't see that it would add anything to the plan.
Okay. But just if we could open that up, that discussion, if we could just again basically to the participants that have raised issues. So Mr. Mitchell, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, we did make some comments on this in our publication draft and our examination statement, because we don't think these key urban regeneration areas are appropriately defined. We don't think they're defined at all, really. I mean, all we really have in the local plan is 5 sentences on what the council thinks might happen without any opportunity to measure or set out some objectives within those areas, or how they can be achieved, and they don't necessarily allow the council to go away or use a strategy to apply for some funding or anything like that in these areas. They're just a series of sort of quite broad statements that sit uncomfortably in the policy, and they're also not referred to in any of the policy maps, really. So it became quite confusing for us to read that policy, and also the references to the SLR sites, strategic land sites elsewhere, and how that actually all tied together. I can understand Mr. Cross saying that his development control colleagues are completely baffled by it as well, because that's my concern, really. I think it comes down to the same point really as before. We need a spatial strategy with some proper distribution targets and numbers in here to help guide where development goes or where intervention might be required. And until we've got that, it's a little bit meaningless to have those sentences in that text.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, Mr. Mitchell's touched on particularly the issue, obviously, about the need for clarity and effectiveness. At the moment, obviously, the plan does show, obviously, the five key urban regenerations listed, obviously, within the policy SER1, but they're not actually clearly set out, obviously, either in the policies map or in a key diagram or any other separate map within the plan itself. Obviously, in terms of the effectiveness, of the actual the plan, in terms of decision makers or developers, local community being able to view where those are, do you think the plan is effective? Do you think there's a need, obviously, just to add clarity on this particular point?
Again, if the examination is minded, I say we are happy to look at incorporating boundaries, whether that's on the key diagram, a pen picture map, or potentially the policies map. We'd be happy to consider that.
Yeah, if I could ask the council, obviously, in terms of to consider obviously that particular option. Really, I think to obviously add to the effectiveness. I think of the plan itself. I think obviously this is something that probably needs to be looked at in terms of a modification. So if the council could consider that in terms of obviously how that might be shown within the plan, obviously in terms of to ensure consistency, obviously with the plan, that would be useful. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, sir. So I was just going to note a legal point on that. So obviously, what you said will have been noted. There's an issue about how that's to be done, though, sir, because obviously your powers are limited to modifications of the plan. So it has to, and I say this because I've been involved in another case fairly close by in the High Court, where there was a change to the policies map that wasn't founded in a modification to the plan. So all I wanted to do was flag up that the mechanism for looking at that has to be through a suggested change to the plan. The policies map can't be altered in isolation.
Okay, thank you for that point. Thank you. Right. Any other points to raise in relation to the key urban regeneration areas at this stage from any participants? Yep, Andrew Rose again, please. Yep.
Thank you, sir. It was just to assist you, sir, really, because I think the key regeneration areas are already shown on the key diagram already in the plan. I think it follows from memory that policy. So appreciate they are blobs, but they already are shown. So just to assist you and to assist the council, sir, clearly, as you've already indicated, you're minded to make a change. It's just to assist you in maybe in that point that Mr. Hunter raised just now, that there's clearly route there to assist, to link the two or clarify the two, if you feel that's
right. It might be just adding additional text potentially to consider, just obviously identifying those specific areas, because obviously in terms of just helping the local community, just obviously if they are specifically Hellbank, South Widnes, West Runcorn, East Runcorn and North Widnes, it's just obviously just so obviously it's a slightly clearer picture that people can pick out even from the key diagram. The way, obviously, as you said, they're pointed out at the moment, Mr. Rose, is obviously there are sort of blobs effectively on the map, and it's not clear exactly which one relates to which. So I think it'd just be just useful as a sort of a pointer, which obviously in terms of somebody looking at the plan, that they can just clearly pick up which area is which.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any other points then to raise in relation to the key urban regeneration areas? Okay, I'm just going to move on to the areas outside the key urban regeneration areas. So again, just in terms of outside the key urban regeneration, does the spatial strategy provide an appropriate planning framework for areas outside the key urban regenerations, including the small settlements in the borough such as Hale and Moore? Again, if we just ask the council first.
Yes, the council considers that the plans that it is entirely clear as to how applications or proposals within those areas will be dealt with. The majority of the areas are either defined as primarily residential, primarily employment, or proposed designations for mixed use, or the individual allocations. There are a couple of sites within the plan that are actually shown as white land, and there is a specific policy, CS N26, dealing with how we will deal with applications on sites that aren't covered by one of the above notations.
Okay, thank you. And just obviously some of the participants have just raised the issue, would the actual plan benefit from a settlement hierarchy showing the levels of housing employment growth on the proposed in each of the settlements?
Again, I say this is a stalking horse for basically trying to secure additional development land in Widnes. We consider the development proportions are appropriate in the plan, and we don't see how adding the figures, what purpose would they serve within the plan in terms of, would we be looking at them as minimums, or would they be taken by the local community as maxima?
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to again open it up to participants that have made comments on these particular points, if they'd like to come in, if they wish to raise any matters at this stage. So, yeah, Ian Gilbert.
Sorry, sir, my internet connection was struggling then. So just to go back on Mr. Cross's point, that our concerns aren't really with the development management effects of having the expectations of these areas set out in the plan. It's more to do with measuring the effectiveness at the time that the local plan comes to be reviewed, and looking forward, noting that it's not it's only a snapshot in time, and as Mr. Cross says, these things will move on.
Is this in relation, just to be clear, is this in relation to the key urban regenerations, or generally in relation to the settlements such as Helm or etc., just to be clear?
Generally, sir, and also on that point, on the settlements outside the main areas, and again, my connection to our server is struggling, but we've raised points with regard to the amount of development land directed towards Preston on the Hill, which it's relevant to this point, sir, and you've got my representations on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, is there any other points that anybody wants to raise in relation to, Mr. Mitchell again?
Yeah. Sorry, it's just one point, is that the council's response to you then talked about stalking horse for more development land because there's already development proportions set out in the plan. Of course, there isn't the development proportions set out in the plan. There's only the list of sites that's provided, just to make that clarification, sir. That's the whole point. We are concerned that there isn't the proportions set out in writing. Thank you.
Okay. Right. There's no other issues again to raise on this matter in terms of the areas outside the key urban regeneration areas. I'm just going to go on to other matters. I know obviously from the council participants' comments on the suggested modifications to policy SCR1 and the supporting text take into account Natural England's comments on the HRA and the recreation mitigation strategy. It is our intention to look at the suggested wording on this policy and other policies as part of the hearing session next Tuesday covering the Halton interim recreation mitigation strategy. It seems to be an opportunity to complete the discussion on that matter, as well as the particular policy references as they arise in one session. Has anybody got any comments they wish to raise on that particular point at this stage? Yeah, Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, sir. It was just a really quick one on that. I'm not sure. I'm down to attend next Tuesday, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that we've no objection to the proposed modification that's set out in the Statement of Common Ground with Natural England. However, without that document being completed, obviously it's not anticipated to be completed until January 23. It's unclear what impact that may have in terms of viability. I know we'll obviously pick this up in matter 11 as well. We just want to kind of flag it now that there needs to be a sufficient contingency and headroom factored into any viability assessment to account for that. That's all. Thank you.
Just to say we can pick that up in the session on the recreation mitigation strategy and viability as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Okay.
Sorry, just on the policies map issue, or the sort of key diagram, in terms of the clarification of the key urban regeneration areas, just to clarify, was it clarification in terms of those areas on the sort of strategic diagram, if you like, on page 38, is it greater clarification on that key diagram that you're looking for, as opposed to the policies map and very detailed boundaries, just for the council's clarification?
Yeah, I think the key diagram would be the way to obviously potentially look at this issue. I think I take the council point about specific boundaries on the policies map. I think it's just trying to ensure for its effectiveness that they look at the option of either a small diagram, either within, obviously on the key diagram probably would be the preferred approach potentially. Okay.
So are there any other views on that in terms of taking that forward as a key diagram, from the council's point of view? Would that
we are happy. We'll draft changes and submit that to the examination as quickly as we can manage.
Okay. Mr. Mitchell?
I obviously made the point because I didn't understand what those areas were or how they were defined or the apportionment of growth. So I think it's rather difficult to suggest that it's only the page 38 diagram at this stage that needs to be looked at. I think it's very much up to the council to come back, given the concern that you raised, sir, and that I raised and others have raised, for the council to tell us what they mean by these key urban regeneration areas, really. And whether that's on the key diagram and or the proposal maps, I'd be looking, if I was a resident, for some sort of definition as to where greenfield land in North Widnes, might be now and in the future, really. So I think it is probably slightly more complicated than just putting some fuzzy boundaries on page 38, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mitchell. I guess, is there any further matters that anybody wishes to raise on this particular matter 3 relating to the spatial strategy? If that's the case, I'm going to close this hearing session. We'll obviously reconvene tomorrow morning at 9:30 to discuss the housing requirements. Thank you for attending, and I look forward to seeing you maybe in future hearing sessions. Thank you. Bye-bye.